Well, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Good day from whichever time zone you've joined from. We are absolutely delighted to see you all with us today. My name is Trudie Lang. I'm from the Global Health Network, and we are very pleased to host this event for the World Health Organization. I'm going to take you through a little bit of housekeeping, but just to say we're very pleased to support this as part of our role as a collaborating centre for the Science Division of the World Health Organization. This meeting today is really important because these guidance we're going to talk about are very much part of the forthcoming action plan. And this is a really key development for everyone working or interested in clinical research. We have an amazing sign up for this meeting, and hopefully most of you have managed to join today on Zoom. But if not, this is also being streamed on YouTube. And I'm going to come back to the questions at the moment, but we're really delighted to see the numbers of people who have registered for this meeting and from where they've joined us across the globe. So I'm going to just take you through a little bit of housekeeping to explain how this meeting will work today. First of all, we're going to record this session and it will be shared later by the Global Health Network, and importantly, alongside all of your questions, which I'll come back to in a second. Hopefully, you might have already worked out that we can translate this call for you, and live translation is available for you now in Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. If you click on language interpretation, which you'll find on the screen, you can find additional languages, and you can use the closed captions, which automatically translate the subtitles. We have a very large audience today, and so the chat, video, and microphone functions are disabled. But we do want to hear from you. This is a session where we really want to get your questions and really make this a very dynamic meeting. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions. And I'm going to work very hard whilst Vasee and Jeremy are speaking to collect these, and I'll put them to Vasee and Jeremy at the end. But we've obviously got an enormous number of people on the call, so your questions won't be wasted. We're going to collate them all and we'll share these with the video after the event. Next slide, please. So I'm delighted in a second to welcome Jeremy, who's the Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, and then I'll pass to Vasee, who's a Senior Advisor for Research and Health at the WHO as well. I'll try and moderate this very busy meeting, but really hope that you all take part as well. So I'm delighted to hand over to Jeremy to open this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Trudie Lang. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm not sure we got the sound and the cameras on, but a very, very warm welcome to
all good.
everybody.
Working well.
Very, very warm welcome to everybody, and appreciate it's Friday the 13th. But that's an auspicious day for launching something, and a truly remarkable set of people joining from around the world. I believe there's close to 11,000 people joining from around the world, from every region and from every continent. So it's a huge honor and privilege to be able to join you. So I'll also just reflect, I spent the morning, which I think is relevant to this as well, actually, with the coming together of three partners in Geneva around health, innovation, science, and technology, which was the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. And the reason I mention that is those three coming together, I think, also gives an impetus to this work and the ability to translate science into people's lives, and to do that through the best available evidence and the science base. And the clinical trials are an absolutely critical component of that. The clinical trials resolution that passed through the World Health Assembly prior to me joining, and I would just like to acknowledge all of the people that made that happen before I came to WHO, was World Health Resolution 75.8, which was sponsored by the United Kingdom and Argentina in 2022. And in essence, it was there to try and to encourage the World Health Organization with all its member states and all our partners around the world to ensure that clinical trials were embedded into public health, clinical and scientific ecosystems around the world in order to ensure that all communities, all people, all patients could be part of clinical trials across the range of what is needed in infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, in prevention, in primary care, all the way through to intensive care, whether clinical, patient-orientated or public health. And importantly, that resolution also put at its heart that communities and patients are central to that, and that we must include and engage and involve patients, patient groups, in all of the design and the implementation of those clinical trials, and then the subsequent uptake of the evidence base on which those clinical trials are based. And I think that was a seminal resolution at the World Health Assembly, and I just pay tribute to everybody that has picked it up since then and made such an effort to push this forward, which has been a remarkable success. The landmark WHO guidance for the best practice in clinical trials, which came out in 2024, I think will be seen as we look back at it as a seminal moment in the way clinical trials are encouraged, facilitated, and happen around the world. And along with the updated Declaration of Helsinki and the soon to be published, I believe, the ICH guidelines E6, I think this puts now together an ecosystem which encourages, facilitates, and ensures that clinical trials happen. This is, of course, and I say this as chief scientist, about ensuring that we have the best available evidence to inform patient care, preventative strategies, and public health in all countries around the world. But actually, it's more important even than that. This is about ensuring that we build equity into the way we conduct clinical and public health research, and that we ensure that access to the interventions that science, this scientific golden age, is going to deliver for us, are accessible and available to communities all around the world. And the best way of making sure that happens is that communities and patients and people around the world are involved in the generation and the subsequent implementation of that evidence. We need to re-engage the scientific and the clinical trial community with the very patients, communities that we serve. And in doing so through this resolution, I believe we can actually transform the way we build equitable access to the interventions we have available today and the interventions that we will have available tomorrow. So I think this is important in clinical trials. It's important in encouraging and facilitating clinical trials. I actually think it has an even bigger purpose, which is to ensure we build greater health equity and we build greater access to the interventions that will make difference to people's lives all over the world. And the clinical trials is one perspective of that. WHO cannot do this on its own. And that's why I pay tribute to the Global Health Network, WHO Collaborative Centres, and so many other partners who have worked with Vasee and the team here to make this what has been developed out of the resolution, and will continue to push through 2025 to make sure that this moves from warm words, moves from resolutions, moves from documents into actually ensuring that clinical trials happen around the world, are inclusive, include diverse communities, and ultimately that the interventions that are tested in those clinical trials are available to the whole world in a more equitable and accessible way than perhaps has all been true in the past. So with that, I'll close. I would like to just hand over to a remarkable colleague, John Reeder, who is the head of the TDR, but also stood in as chief scientist between Dr. Samir and myself, who deserve enormous credit. I came in after the resolution was published, and John and Samir and Vasee here deserve the enormous credit for having this. So I would just like to pass over to John for a few words before handing back to Vasee, and pay tribute to the leadership role that John has played in encouraging, pushing this whole thing through the WHO, the regional offices, country offices, and making this a reality. So John, hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. And just to echo your thanks to Global Health Network, but also the appreciation for the number of people who come online for this. But I think this says a lot about the interest in this area of clinical trials. It's a time that's ripe for change. We've all realized that things weren't done quite as well as they might have been done. We had the lessons to learn of COVID, and we've been able to pull together at a political level throughout our organization, and certainly with having the science division created as part of the division to be a focal point for this, and out into the communities. And we've been out there in the regions, in the countries, talking to people in this. And there's a consistent message, and that message is we are ready for change. We are ready to improve this. We are ready to do things differently. And I think the important point of the framework published earlier this year, it's just not about the technicalities. It's just not all about the trial design, but it also is about the inclusivity. It is about the ownership, and it is about the community engagement that is necessary behind this. And I think we're starting to pull together the prospects for a really bright future in clinical trials. And I'm very happy that you're all listening in today, because we need to take this off the paper and into the field and really make a difference for how we do trials. So thanks, Jeremy, and back to Vasee.
Thank you so much, John and Jeremy. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that that we're really representing the culmination or another step in a set of activities that have been ongoing for years, even before the resolution was passed. So it's not as if we're starting from nothing. And by contrast, we were required by the resolution, and we made very extensive efforts to ensure that we're building on the work of many of you who are listening in right now. There are many initiatives that were already calling for a lot of the what is in the guidance. So I think it's important just to acknowledge the hundreds of people out there who have contributed to this. So now let's see if the technology is going to work to share some slides. So this is part of our work in supporting implementation of the resolution, as we were directed to do by the member states in 2022. But also, whenever we develop guidance from WHO, we seek to support member states and all the relevant audiences in how that guidance can enable their work. So here, this is one of a number of activities. Here we're focusing more on researchers around the world, but I think there are many different stakeholder groups. We will continue with other activities where we'll be having specific fora with regulators, with ethics authorities, with patient organizations, with community engagement organizations, with those on specifically various different underrepresented population groups. So this is one of a number of activities. If I have one message, it's please don't hesitate to contact us or any of our core partners. We're really only enabling the work and facilitating the work of a large number of partners, which is in a way a global movement for reforming clinical trials so that we better generate evidence to serve patient needs, community needs, population needs. There is a new logo that I don't think we've shown before, which is this Global Clinical Trials Forum logo. So in addition to the World Health Organization, we, with the launch of the Global Action Plan, which will be coming up in 2025, a key purpose is to agree with partners out there, and we already have a large number of partner organizations that want to take part, where the activities in the Global Action Plan are aligned with their own strategies and work plans. We would like to enable their work, bring them together, hopefully help. Some country experiences can help in other countries, some regions can help in other regions. So that's the whole purpose of this Global Clinical Trial Forum. And I'll come back to this timeline right at the end. This is an important background. If anybody doesn't know about ICTRP, it stands for the International Clinical Trial Registration Platform, which here is visualized through the R&D Observatory, an important resource we have in the Research for Health Department in the Science Division. And this was created from previous resolutions, World Health Assembly resolutions. So it shows a couple of important features of the global landscape, that trials are growing, but in a patchy way around the world. So we have major neglected parts of the world. We talk to underrepresented populations in clinical trials. Probably the most stark underrepresented population is Africa as a whole, where we have less than 3% of the clinical trial database globally from Africa, despite the fact that we have such vast disease burden there. Similarly, for the Eastern Mediterranean region, that is also very neglected. High-income countries, many of them have seen the importance of developing their clinical trial ecosystems as part of their economic development, as part of the broader science or R&D agenda. And what we see from the global trend is that line in the top graph that it overtook the other two lines, which are the Americas and Europe, a few years ago, is the Western Pacific region, which is now actually the global epicenter in terms of numbers of trials, driven by large increases in China. Also in the Southeast Asia, India has clearly grown very dramatically in terms of numbers of trials, and China is now second. India is now fourth, with USA number one and Japan number three. So there are these important changes to be aware of. But then the second point is, while we do need more clinical trial capacity, the numbers of trials itself do not equate to the quality of evidence. And we really need, beyond trials and trial capacity, to ensure that we have high quality evidence that is generated from these trials. This is a graphic from the Living Guidelines work that's led by Janet Diaz in WHO during the pandemic. It highlights where we have strong recommendations either in favor or against. This will always mean that we have good quality randomized controlled trials underlying this. And so we do have good examples of trials that really provided robust evidence and changed global practice. But it was also clear, and this is a publication from US FDA colleagues during the pandemic, that there was a large amount of research waste and very many thousands of trials did not contribute to the evidence base. So we both need more capacity, but more focus on good quality trials, which is a major driver for the guidance. In our work, and we had 6 in-person consultations in all of the regions, which are continuing, as well as global in-person consultations and a number of online consultations where we received input from thousands of individuals. These were the 4 key sets of barriers around, are we starting with answering the right question, and then do we have the right design and implementation to answer those questions? A lack of adequate engagement from patients and communities, and Jeremy and John have both already spoken to this, but this is a major part of the background. Lack of inclusivity of clinical trial populations, gaps in infrastructure and capabilities, and this is not only research capabilities, but also support to research ethics committees, support to regulators. All of these are equally important. In some countries, if one part of these is well supported, but the others aren't, then we still are left with the overall clinical trial system having rate limiting steps. And then we do see inefficiencies in regulatory and ethics, the overall clinical trial approval system. And this has been acknowledged by several countries. We already see some country clinical trial ecosystem strengthening activities that have been launched, which are very much in line with the resolution and with the guidance, where they're really looking holistically at the whole system and trying to identify how to ensure that they absolutely ensure the rigor of trial design, adhering to ethical standards, but at the same time that we find efficient ways to allow pivotal trials to continue. And this is an important area, and it really is an issue in high income, middle income, and low income countries. So what I'm sharing here is what we learned from consultation with all of you that led into the guidance. Now, moving on to a few slides on the content of the guidance. Important to be clear that we now have this global WHO guidance that has these 5 equally important elements for what are good clinical trials. The first part on design is clearly central, and all of this is aligned with ICH E6R3, E8R1, the Declaration of Helsinki, with changes that are really all coming into alignment. The second part on respecting rights and well-being of participants. The third, I think we have more emphasis here in the WHO guidance than we have had previously on collaboration, with all of the right parties being at the table and being included from the beginning, by which I mean even in the questions that the trial should answer, and whether the interventions that are included are feasible to implement, whether the outcomes are included are meaningful to patients, whether the populations really are addressing the key needs for populations that the interventions could benefit. So we think this engagement aspect is really central, as is transparency around registration. Has long been a global norm for clinical trials. Ensuring that all trials are reported is still a work in progress. We see that there are some areas of trials where we don't have solid reporting of all the results. So this is something that we need to work on, as well as working on how to move forward with data sharing. Being feasible for context is also another equally important part that hasn't perhaps had as much emphasis as it should have. And then finally, the fifth part is really central, as are all of these, on risk-based quality management. So it is not the case that all randomized trials have the same risk level. And I am aware that in some areas of the world or regions, countries, that there isn't a solid set of procedures to have a risk basis within randomized trials. So if you have low risk trials where you're dealing with licensed interventions or perhaps not even medicinal products at all, for example, in mental health, but let's take licensed medicines. There are some randomized trials which are involving interventions that have safety databases of millions of people and have been used for decades. We shouldn't have the same procedures to oversee those trials as we have for early stage pre-licensure trials. So the risk basis upfront is important, and the same applies for the complexity of amendments. Being able in an agile way to look at low complexity amendments in a different way to high complexity amendments is really important. And we see some countries are explicitly moving ahead with this. Some are quite advanced. I saw this week, for example, a press release from the UK where part of that is explicitly an updated clinical trials legislatory regulatory framework. And part of that is exactly this risk basis and proportionate approaches. This area is fully aligned with ICH, where E6R3, E8R1 very much talk about risk-based proportionate approaches. There was something called the Quality by Design initiative as part of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which was talking about many of the same sorts of issues. So it's not necessarily completely new, but we seem to be still in the relatively early stages of implementing this. So we're very interested to liaise with those of you who are advancing. So the next section is on a new framework for strengthening national clinical research ecosystems, which need to be taken holistically as one part of the science and related to the R&D ecosystems in countries. We have these 4 pillars, but importantly, a lot of this is cross-cutting. So we shouldn't only see this in vertical pillars, but there are cross-cutting issues around collaboration and transparency, etc. But the pillars are regulatory systems, here referring to the medicinal product regulators, the central aspects of research ethics oversight, clinical trial infrastructure, and national research governance. Now, we've already talked about many of these, but it's really worth looking through the document. And some of you may be interested in only one of these, but any one of these could be a talk in its own right. They're all really very important and get quite a lot of emphasis in the guidance. So ensuring that the trials address relevant questions that fill gaps in evidence, ensuring that we have engagement embedded in the right way, which is a responsibility of the research teams, but also needs to be acknowledged by funders and regulators. Ensuring that we address underrepresented populations appropriately. It's still the case that many clinical trial programs exclude older people, those with comorbidities, pregnant women, infants, children. You could see this through the lens of rare diseases, which are clearly neglected, AMR, neglected tropical diseases, parts of the world such as Africa. Now, sometimes it would be appropriate in a clinical trial not to enroll pregnant women. Sometimes pregnant women, as just taking one example, are excluded for really no scientific or ethical reason. And in fact, it would contradict the long-standing ethical principles of inclusion, for example, of pregnant women, which have been clearly articulated going back to SIOM's guidance in 2016. So there's an agenda for really now to move forward with even more momentum as to how we address some of these questions of inclusion of underrepresented populations so that we don't preclude access to interventions in these populations, which is the case at the moment still in some cases. The next part is equally important in that we're really calling for moving away from some assumption about what is the standard trial design to starting with what the question is, and then considering what is the most efficient, ethical way to answer that question. In some cases, that could be a fixed two-arm design. In other cases, pragmatic trials may be really the best way to answer the question, often with point of care, randomization, decentralized trials where we need to answer questions outside of traditional fixed clinical trial units. So for example, in primary care, full adoption of digitization and transparency of procedures. And then in some cases, adaptive designs, factorial designs, which aren't that new. We have famous trials from the 90s that use these techniques, but there's still a lot more that can be done to move forward with adopting these designs where they can help. So again, a big agenda there. And again, many of you out there as partners have been working on this for decades. But we think, again, how do we take momentum to move forward with this? Now then, onto international trials. There are a number of networks that already exist, and we really seek to enable the work of these networks where they are meeting local needs and where that work is mutually beneficial. There are many questions that cannot be answered at the national level where we absolutely need international collaboration. And then another major part is on promoting transparency, which I've already talked about, and reducing waste, which in my personal view, in some ways is one of the most complex issues, because we know that there are many trials that do receive authorization. And this is not only true in the pandemic. Wherever people have looked at analyses of the proportion of trials that are conducted that are taken up into evidence, it's a fairly small proportion. So there's a whole area of work to really examine how we can reduce waste and better use resources. Then we have a section on recommendations for policymakers, where the central focus here is on how do we provide an enabling environment so that patient-centric, high-quality ethical research is enabled, the careers of clinical researchers are enabled so far as we're meeting patient and population needs. And I think many authorities have already moved in this direction or are moving in this direction, and we hope these recommendations can support this move. Also, another policy direction for us is exploring how we can move away from project-based funding, where a lot of the capacities that are developed are lost when the projects end, to having clarity that there are core competencies that need to be supported through other modalities, perhaps through national support of research arms linked to health systems. So the coordinators, managers, really can't be relying on project funding. And this is linked to the idea of always on, always warm clinical networks. I've already talked about the coordination and streamlining, increasing efficiencies. Now, this is not in any way to take away from the really important work of research ethics committees, who it's by contrast, they are absolutely central to this. We have many, many, many thousands of individuals who are giving their time to research ethics committees and the work of regulatory authorities. It's more about how they can work together to ensure that there is an efficient system, including some degree of national coordination, which in some countries doesn't yet exist in terms of national ethics authorities. In other countries, it exists very well. So it's an area, I think, for each country to look at and see if they really have the efficiencies in place. And then a focus this year and during 2025 for us is going to be on agreeing at the global level, and then for countries to agree appropriate ways of monitoring their progress against all of these recommendations, which, as I said, much of this is underway, but we do need to be able to monitor progress. Now, another important part of work that we have embarked upon as a result of the consultation process, because you pointed out that this was needed, we do have benchmarking tools for the regulatory systems, which are led by a department called Regulation and Pre-Qualification here at WHO, which is very well seen by countries. And there's a lot of effort that has been put into meeting these benchmarking tools by countries themselves. And there's a maturity level framework there. So that has been successful. in the science division and in John's department, the Research for Health department, and this is led by Andreas Rice and Catherine Littler, there is a research ethics committee benchmarking tool, which is more recent, but is now going into widespread use. What we are now developing, and we're seeking your input into consultation on this, is a clinical trial unit maturity framework, which is intended to be there as a self-assessment tool. So the whole aim and framing here is that it can be used by the units themselves to see where they are in terms of their capabilities according to the WHO framework, and where the next steps could be in improving their own functionalities. But the utility of this is going to be based upon how much it really is meaningful for people working in different settings around the world. And so we have a group that won a competitive bid to develop the draft for us with representatives from many countries around the world. They're going to be delivering a draft to us, which will then go through in-person consultations in every region, and we will make any changes that are necessary from those in-person consultations, then broader online consultations until we arrive at a final framework here. That could be available as early as the end of 2025, but if we need to take longer for the consultations, then we will. And then perhaps the most important part is the network of partners that can come together to really move this forward, which we are calling the Global Clinical Trial Forum, and we're launching this logo here. There'll be the next large global forum meeting in April next year here at WHO. And the main purpose there will be for hopefully some of you out there to put your hands up and say, this aspect of the plan really is aligned with what we have been interested in for some time. And let's agree that we will take forward this part, and we will share our learnings with you and with others, so that we can all move together on progress against all of these areas that I've outlined that came from the consultation and came from you all. Translations into all these languages are underway, and we'll be having specific fora to reach out in other languages, which will be led by the regional offices over the next year or so. The regional offices will also be leading the training material and the adaptation of this material to their local contexts, as well as implementation tools. And we have 6 regional work plans that are led by colleagues in the regional offices. These are the 9 areas. I won't go through these because we've touched on all of them. One part that I didn't talk about is that we do plan to have a global clinical trials training resource hub, where we are not repeating what you have already done. So we're accessing training packages that have already been developed. Where there was a need to develop additional training, we're doing that. And that training is also going to be translated into languages where it's requested. So when we have the forum meeting, we'll be looking at which partners are going to volunteer to take forward actions in each of these areas. Also related to this are these, the utility of what we do really is only as useful as it leads to change. And so we have these categories that I've already talked about, where I think many of you are already working on implementing changes that are aligned with these categories. So I won't go through these, but at the end there, I mentioned these public health clinical practice oriented trials. So just to say, to be clear, I'm sure this is clear to you all, those of you working on investigational product trials will need to continue to follow ICH. ICH has been very successful in regulatory harmonization and supporting the work of industry in generating data that is acceptable for many different regulatory authorities. And the support from private sector to those industry trials can come in a synergistic way if it goes into resources that can be used for public health, clinical practice oriented trials. But I think one of the areas for change is really acknowledgement by regulatory systems around the world and by funders that in addition to the investigational product trials, we do need to support perhaps non-commercial trials that are answering really critical questions about how to improve clinical practice, service delivery. Many of these will be cluster randomized trials. We need more trials, for example, at the primary care level. And many of these are around optimizing the impact of existing interventions. So dose sparing or combinations of treatments, or ways to actually deliver combinations of individual interventions and packages that have long been recommended, but we see that there are still major gaps in uptake of interventions. And then this work on the enabling environment we see as absolutely critical, where the training and the thinking about how to have efficient trial approval processes, or acknowledge and learn lessons from those of you who have already put these in place, how we move to the always-on networks, and how we really support. And you'll see that the first action there in the action plan is about local leadership and national support, because much of what is being called for really can only be taken forward through that local leadership and national support for sustained capacities, while international donors clearly will have a major role as well. And then to end, this is the timeline. So the resolution was adopted in 2022. We had our initial forum the year after. The guidance was launched a couple of months ago, but next year you can see is going to be a very busy year for us in supporting all of you in taking forward the guidance into actions on the ground that is meaningful for clinical care and for patient health. And I did want to include, this is not by any means all of the internal collaborations. These are not staff on my team, except for Wei Zhang and John Owell, who are both on my team, and I wanted to thank them. The rest of these are WHO staff who choose to collaborate with us because they have shared objectives with some of the aspects of this work plan. And I just wanted to thank the wonderful collaboration that we have with all of the regional offices and many, many departments and divisions in HQ. And I didn't manage to get photos for all of you. For example, Kwasi and Yako and Constance and Afro we're also working with, but I don't have a photo. AVRF is a very important example of a long-standing initiative, which is aligned to what we're doing here, that we're seeking to further support. And I obviously don't have photos of all the external partners, but there are so many external partners that have been working with us. Just to mention a few, the funding is from the UK National Institute of Health Research and the UK Department of Health and Social Care, from EDCTP, from the Gates Foundation. We have the Global Health Network as a collaborating centre. Thank you. And we have incorporated and adapted guidance. We haven't started from scratch. We've very much started with what already existed, particularly the CIOMS guidance, the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative. We've been working with ICH Secretariat, and thank you to the E6 Working Group. And we've been working with the World Medical Association for the update to Declaration of Helsinki. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Well done, Vasee.
Back to you, Trudie.
Thank you very much. That was a really excellent gallop through those. I've been furiously reading all the questions in the Q&A. We've also got people watching live on YouTube, and we've had those questions filtered through. I just want to thank everybody for such wide and deep questions. I mean, truly excellent. And just to reassure everybody, please keep posting them whilst we're going through them, because we will make sure that we collate all of them, because they are really important. We've got such a huge number of people attending today. And also for people watching this video later, when you watch it on catch up, please keep sending these questions in to us, because we have such a large body of people and such excellent global representation as you're here. Actually, your comments are really fundamentally important. One of the real aims of today was to make this a really interactive session, and for Vasee and John and Jeremy to hear from you all and have this engagement, which is so important for the uptake and implementation of these guidelines. And what I'm really delighted to see, trying to quickly pull off these questions as they came in, just the variety of places around the world you all are, and so thank you, and also the variety of questions. So I'm going to try and put these I'll put them to all three. Sometimes I might pick on one of our panel. But just to say again, please keep posting your questions. We'll get through as many as we can, but we're going to make a really comprehensive document of this after the event. And also, if you're watching this later in your own time, please also send in your feedback. And also, this happens all the time in the community on the Global Health Network. please answer the questions for each other, because I know I've just seen some of the experts who are on this call from around the world. You all know the answers to these, or you'll have ideas. And so don't leave it to us and John, Vasee and Jeremy to answer either. Please write in the Q&A your own responses, or feed them into us later. So this was quite a feat trying to go through these whilst Vasee was talking. But I hope the ones I've pulled off just give a really good reflection of the thoughts coming through. And I suggest we pass around the three of you to comment. But just to say, let's not lose any of the detail, because we can catch these later too. So first of all, thank you, Mansour in Afghanistan. Mansour reflects that it's really difficult to sometimes get the quality that we want in the trial design, which is exactly your point at the beginning, Vasee. And this, he feels, is down to poor management in the field and lack of training and awareness of how to design trials well, and support for doing research within the health systems around the world. How do you think these guidelines can improve national support and strengthen the research system really in the health systems to reduce waste and improve design? So across the three of you, please. Just a good one to start with straight away.
Thank you so much. So it's a great question. And I would just say that it comes from Pakistan, but I think the same question could be asked anywhere.
Afghanistan, this one. But yes, exactly.
Sorry?
It was Afghanistan.
Oh, Afghanistan. Sorry.
Exactly that. That's why I picked it straight away, because
yes.
This is ubiquitous, right?
Yes. So I think it goes to quite a fundamental point, which is that the resolution is on clinical trials, but really those of us who are working to advance clinical outcomes, public health, of course, we would see the broader health research perspective. And I think in order to enable that, we clearly need engagement between researchers and the health system. And so I think one important aspect of the resolution is it's not only focusing on what some have seen as the traditional scope of clinical trials, which is focusing on investigational products, which is the ICH framework. So historically, what a lot of people have seen as good clinical practice is the ICH framework, which is written by regulators and with a lot of input from industry, and is very, very helpful for investigational products. But going forward, what we're calling for is a lot more focus on exactly where the question is coming from, on training researchers as well as health workers to engage in the whole cycle of identifying what the gaps are that come out from clinical practice. So gaps in how they can better serve their populations, so that we can design clinical research, sometimes clinical trials that answer those questions. So in order to do that, we will need training that is suitable for different types of constituencies. There's training for people who will work full-time on clinical trials, but also training for those who contribute. And there are some countries that have models for this. It does seem to take a long time for the country approaches to training to really bear fruition, but we can hopefully accelerate this. One model would be, for example, having designated nurses who choose to engage in research and are trained to be research nurses, but are supported by the health system to coordinate practical studies that align with needs in countries. We can contribute to this by, and we will be, looking at what training material is available for people working in different parts of the system, whether they're health workers or researchers that are working on different parts of clinical trials or clinical research. So I think we need a big focus on fit for purpose training packages. But we also need to, some people have used the phrase democratizing research, that there's this sense that there's a very high bar or barrier to taking part in clinical trials. And we do need very rigorous safeguards for the early stage trials, for phase 1, first in human trials. But it is possible in these pragmatic clinical trials, which can be lower risk, maybe using licensed interventions, to find ways to involve a much broader range of stakeholders than have been traditionally involved in clinical trials in the past. So those are some initial thoughts.
Jeremy or John, if we'd like to add to that at all.
I think there's a long answer. Let's go on to further questions to give. I'm sure there are lots of questions coming through.
There are. I'm scribbling like mad and picking them up as we carry on. So the next question are for and in fact this is Susan from Liberia who posed this, but I'm going to collate what I say from probably there must be 25 questions on this across the whole topic, but I'm just so thank you, Susan, for kicking off, and for everybody else who's written on this point. And you've both pointed out in your presentations, and John as well, that one of the unique pieces that's come through both GCPR3 that's coming through, but also the Trials Resolution 75.8. Many of us are just really pleased to see how community engagement is finally being really taken forward, patient-centric design, and really basing design and the whole operations with community engagement actively at the heart and centre of this. So Susan asked particularly, what are the barriers to community engagement, and can you, many of the other questions just really talk about this focus, why it's important, and really how this can be taken up in a really meaningful way.
Thanks, Trudie. And this is a really important issue. And, you know, to be blunt, the first barrier to community engagement in clinical trials is that clinical trialists don't ask the community. You know, there needs to be a real conversation there to start with, and a real recognition that without the community being involved, you will not get the success. We've seen this time and time again. We have many case examples, but it's been a lesson slow learned, I think. But obviously, it's more complicated than that. And there are also the elements of the community building its trust in the science and the scientists, really important to this. Capacity within the communities to really have that conversation as well, and concentrating. And as Vasee just mentioned, this idea of democratizing science is about everybody understanding that it can be a tool that they can use. Not everybody is going to be a clinical trial designer, but the community should be in a position to understand what the principles are that they're discussing in here. And I think once they're on board, once you have trust, once you have that base level of knowledge, then you have the real start to be able to engage in a meaningful and honest way with community. And we've seen time and time again, when we get into that sweet spot, we really do get success in trials. Absolutely critical area.
Let's move on. There's probably so many questions.
There are so many questions. Thank you. I think I'm going to jump to a totally different topic, but I think this probably will land with Jeremy's area of interest as well. And again, this has come through from several people across the globe. Actually, there's just so many on this. This overlaps really. One, the use of AI, but also I think they overlap sometimes with just use of some of the data science pieces and use of real world data. And again, I know these are two different points, but they're joined up in some of the questions, but I think we should focus this firstly, perhaps we'll split it out. Again, like community engagement, one of the strong things that have come through the resolution, but also the new GCP and the guidelines can really help us on this. What do the panel think around the opportunities, but also the risks of use of real world data or the advances in data science? And also, can the use of AI help some of these things get taken forward? And I can pull down on some of the questions we've got below that if I don't hear them in your answers. So let's see how you go. But maybe Jeremy, you want to start on that one.
Yeah, I can do. But so it is a great question, and one of the things that science and in this perspective, clinical research needs to do is anticipate what is coming, and we are clearly in the middle or at the start of a major disruption that's coming with digitalization, with much better use and access to data that is also being democratized, and also the use of AI. I think where we need to position clinical research and the broader research community is not pretending that's not going to happen, because it is going to happen, And then to think, how can we best use it in the most ethical way that can build trust in the communities that John was talking about just now, and that we can use digital systems, data systems, and indeed the increasing coming of artificial intelligence in order to facilitate clinical trials and in order to facilitate the availability and accessibility of those clinical trials. That will include making sure that the communities that everybody is working with on this call and around the world have access to that information. And that goes into the broader discussion around how, if we are going to democratize all of this, then we need to build scientific ecosystems that allow this to happen, and the capacity to use those skills and those new approaches in order to facilitate the work that we're all talking about. So I was fortunate enough this week to be at the Nobel Prize ceremony. AI and data and digital came into two at least of those Nobel Prizes this week, and how we can use those to maximize the opportunity that comes with it, to build trust with the communities, but also to minimize the potential or real harm that could come from it. And Vasee mentioned earlier the work that the WHO team are doing around ethics. That includes a big piece of work on ethics of digital, ethics of AI, and ethics of how these may be used to the maximum benefit of the number of people. What we shouldn't do is pretend this disruption is not happening, and stick to our old ways of doing things, because it is happening. People are going to demand it, communities are going to demand it, and we need to be ahead of the curve. And at the moment, I think we're a little bit behind the curve in how we may best use these advances.
Great, thank you. Vasee, have you got anything to add on that one?
No, no, just keen to get through as many different questions.
Exactly. And I've grouped a lot of them together. So we got a good question from Pakistan. Clinical trial registries are really important, as we know, and there's lots of examples around the world of the sort of large main clinical registries, but there's also some national ones. I think the particular point here is it would be useful to have a registry in Pakistan. What's WHO's position on country-based registries and how they could be more inclusive, and if anything underway to support these?
So the registries are absolutely foundational to all of this work. We have to have information on the status of the work, and the registries underlie that. I just want to mention Ghassan Karam, who's the manager of ICTRP, and Sarah and Anna Lara, who are in. Anna Lara is the head of the unit. What we do is we have a set of standards that any country can use if they seek to develop a national registry, which can then be incorporated into ICTRP. So it does take some prioritization and some resources from the national authorities to develop the registries to meet these standards. We do not require that people use registries that are necessarily national registries. It's just important that they use registries. So another option is to use one of the other WHO compliant registries. We know some countries very much would like to have their own registries. If they do, we can support them. And we need to move to the point where everyone doing a clinical trial anywhere in the world has a registry that they're comfortable to use and meets our standards, and so that we can import the data and we have clarity. Another part of this is the quality of data in the registries, which is not the same everywhere, because the registries sometimes need more resources to improve what they can do to check quality. We really should be ensuring that those responsible for filling out the registries are completing at least the minimum number of data fields. Another part of this, again, AI probably could relate to almost any one of these questions, but here some people have approached us to discuss exploring whether we could apply AI to be able to interrogate the global registry database in ways that we can't currently do. And I think, like everything else, I can't predict how quickly that's going to progress with AI, but I would suspect it will move very quickly. And it may be that we can provide quite a lot more than we can at the moment by adding in AI approaches to the way we're doing it at the moment.
Trudie, can I just add to that? The registries, I mean, the word registries sounds really dull and administrative and bureaucratic. It is also a mechanism by which democratization of this can happen, because having worked a lot with the cancer community, pan-European cancer communities and the rest of the world, and also around what's called the rare disease communities, it's also a window on what is an opportunity for communities and people and patients, their families, to get involved in clinical trials when they wish to. So we should see registries not as a bureaucratic administrative thing, but actually as a way of ensuring that the world and the communities around the world know what clinical trials are going on, because that builds trust, it builds engagement and involvement that John was talking about earlier, and allows people to join clinical trials when they, their families and their communities wish to. So we should see registries as an active way of democratizing what is available around the world, rather than as an administrative and bureaucratic process.
Brilliant. Excellent. And just to reassure everybody, we're trying to pull as many of these questions together. I'm collating some, but keep posting them up, and we are going to make sure we collect all of these alongside the meeting. Okay, so now just moving to something totally different. Nehemiah from Nigeria has asked a great question, and again, this overlaps with many others. It's really important that we have locally led trials, and we need way more trials across many of these regions, which is what this whole thing is about today. We also value and obviously recognise the importance of pharma trials, and the two shouldn't be happening in isolation. Please, could you outline any initiatives that are going to link about linking up pharma trials and more local pragmatic trials, and where you all believe the relationships exist between these?
So that's a great question. And I do think that they can be synergistic. They can be synergistic, or they can be less synergistic. And we have rules about how we engage with the private sector, but at the same time, it's absolutely central that we do engage with the private sector. So we have been doing that. And I'd like to acknowledge IFPMA, who have engaged very strongly in this process, as have DCVMN, which is the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturers Network. IFPMA is the Global Federation of Multinational Pharmaceutical Companies. There's also a Generics and Biosimilars Association called IGBA, and the CROs are an important part of this. And I think they all see that what we're talking about here intersects with their interests. And so I think that really is the short answer to the question. We are interacting very strongly according to our rules with industry. And I think there's a lot of scope, a lot of positive scope for how they can work synergistically with this. And for example, if we can find ways to set up the clinical research infrastructure that countries need, there's no reason at all why it can't attract inward investment to answer questions that the private sector need. And then that capacity that comes in from the investment can also be there to meet some of the other needs that will need to be publicly funded. And there are some countries that specifically have, I won't name them, because if I name some, then I'll probably miss others. But I think a good model that some countries have is they have a specific mechanism to attract inward investment for private sector trials. But at the same time, they have a very clear framework for the capacities that they want to answer questions that need to be embedded in maybe non-commercial trials. It does mean for the latter, we need public sources of funding as well as the private sector funding. So I don't think it's the case that private sector funding alone is going to answer all the questions that we need from clinical trials, but they can have a major role.
Excellent. Right, sorry, I'm scribbling as I'm writing. So here's a really good different question, which I think makes a really great point. This is Eric from Kenya. So we're really seeing major advances in medical engineering and biomedical devices. How can these guidelines apply to those sorts of trials and studies?
So I think an important feature of these guidelines is that we are completely agnostic about the media that is going to be used to generate the data and transfer data. And something very unfortunate that has happened with the history of clinical trials is that there's been this misunderstanding that the quality equals a hard copy with a signature and a date. And that really is out of date now. So clearly more and more the data is going to be coming from digital devices. And the way that we wrote this guidance, we took into account a lot of input from that sector, so that there is nothing, I'm not even sure we mentioned the word paper in the guidance. It's all about ensuring design is appropriate, that we adhere to standards, that we have risk-based approaches for monitoring, etc. And all of that can be done in a way that can apply to however the data is collected. Obviously, you may need different data privacy frameworks depending on the different ways that the data is collected. But within our framework, we're agnostic to how the data is collected.
Jeremy or John, do you want to make any more comments on those?
I just think we're also agnostic in this. I mean, I think clinical trials also sometimes are seen as a drug or a vaccine. And increasingly in the future, they will also be digital. They will actually also, and we're aware of some of these, be actually trials of AI-derived approaches to interventions, whether preventative or other. And so actually when the team and Vasee were putting all this together, trying to anticipate what is coming and how that is going to be disrupted. So this is not just about drug A versus drug B. It is also about other interventions which are going to have huge either clinical or public health impact. And I think that's how we would all like to see this work framed.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm pulling a few points together on this next one as well. I think it's a really important area. So one of the people writing a question, some of them posted as anonymous, and I can't see exactly where they are, but we've got so much global coverage. It's incredible. And this has popped up several times. So there's 2 points really. People are saying that there seems to be this propensity that if a pathogen is studied in a laboratory and it's a pathogen that everybody's working on around the world, so that follows that there's observational and then clinical trials. So there's this, natural narrowing of the focus around what's happening in the labs is dictating what's happening in the trials and those sort of main areas of interest. Equally, others have said in here that there's obviously far too few trials on rare diseases and especially rare medical genetic studies and genetic diseases. So I think this is a really good overarching point, is how do you think these guidelines, and then we're extrapolating that to the resolution and also R3, how could this really help in having more studies in diseases that are not benefiting from evidence at the moment?
The resolution actually did. Oh, sorry. No. The resolution doesn't mention rare diseases specifically, and some of what we're calling for around, for example, strengthening registries, it very much speaks to how we can seek to address diseases or health conditions that have a very low incidence. Clearly, this is where large-scale collaborations are going to be necessary in order to reach any kind of sample size. But by having these international collaborations, it should help allow, for one thing, patients to identify where interventions are being developed and potentially try to access clinical trials. And that is actually a very important use case for the registries. When the resolution in 2005 passed that led to the International Clinical Trial Registry Platform, a central focus was meeting the needs of patients. And really that's at the core of what the registry should do. So I think it's a very, very important, really neglected part of the neglected space. And I think this is one of the areas that I've seen, is that some things are so neglected sometimes that they don't really even have a voice. And we have to somehow give a voice to any key areas where we're not able to serve their needs through clinical research up until now.
Maybe I'd also just spin that a little bit and say that there are many diseases that affect a lot of people that are neglected because the populations are neglected. And so we have a kind of the different side of a similar question here. And part of this is the lack of incentive for the R&D to be done to get to a trialable product in these. But also, I think one of the keys to increasing the trialing for neglected diseases would be by increasing the capacity in the countries that those diseases occur. And we've seen this with onchocerciasis, for example, in West Africa, and the effort that was put in to build local networks for trialing interventions into this for this rarer disease as well. So I think we have that aspect as well. And the second aspect, I think, the idea of building local research capacity to drive trials, I would really hope that will also drive trials of some of the diseases that are, I refuse to call them neglected diseases. I prefer to say that they're diseases of neglected or forgotten populations. And hopefully this will help advance this idea as well.
Excellent. Any more on that one? Nope, we'll move on. Okay. So I'm going to just change tack a little bit here. So this is a really great, what seemingly seems a very straightforward question, but I think it could almost bring everything together because it's really the very purposes, I think, Vasee, isn't it? So Peter from Kenya asked very simply, how does he apply this locally in his context? So how do these get taken up in his country, in Kenya? So I think that's really what that's why so many people have joined the call today to hear this. So just some advice from each of you, I think, on how people might take these up in their own countries.
Well, the first point is to be aware of it. So it's already great that we have so many people from around the world. And then if you would like Peter to contact us afterwards and discuss specific activities in Kenya, we need the stakeholders, if you want to implement the guidance, to go through it and consider what changes it really means for you. There are certain changes in how researchers would go about their practice, but also other members of the community, so the research ethics committees, the regulators. So there's a big agenda to really take this forward. We already have had some discussions with some of the Kenyan authorities, and I understand that there is a process underway in Kenya to look at potential updates to the clinical trial ecosystem, and we'll continue to support that. But I think it can be at every level. So there are, one part of the framing for us was that this needed to focus on clinical trials, but the needs for health research are absolutely not restricted to clinical trials. So I would point you to a large number of resources, and actually a lot of them are on the Global Health Network. There are resources for anyone who wishes to start out in research, and don't hesitate to reach out to us, because there is always a research question that is maybe in front of you. Whatever your work is, if you're in the health sector, there will be a research question that comes up, and what we're seeking to do in WHO with partners is really put tools in your hands to help you to go on that journey to answer that question in a way that is really meaningful for you in your work and supporting patients in your community.
Trudie, can I just add, and I've got to take the opportunity because so many people online, and it's been a big piece of work in 2024, which John originally chaired internally within the science team, and Fatima and others have now taken it forward. But I just wanted to link it to what Vasee just said there. Clinical trials is the focus of today, and it's a critical component of a health research and scientific ecosystem. But one of the pieces of work, which, as I say, John chaired and Fatima is now taking on within the science team at WHO, is a piece of work next year, which we would welcome everybody on this call and all the countries to be part of. And that is to ask how countries do and how countries in the future could use their domestic resources to support their broad scientific ecosystem. I think there is a shift in center of gravity for science going on around the world at the moment. And actually Vasee's graph earlier around the growth of clinical trials in Western Pacific region is a demonstration of that. But I believe that if we're going to improve the health in an equitable way at a global level, then the domestic support sustained with international partnerships and collaboration, supported by domestic resources for the scientific ecosystem, is a crucial route to which health will be improved, but also how economic growth will happen and job opportunities for the next generation will be generated. Science is an amazing way of improving economic growth and providing job opportunities. So in the science team at WHO, we see the clinical trials as the vanguard of what we're doing, but we would like to talk and are talking to many countries about how they support their broader scientific ecosystem and how they shift the center of gravity through domestic resources, which gives power, ownership, and the sustainability of this whole infrastructure, which I think is critical to improving national health, national resilience, national security, being able to respond to crises, but also about providing economic growth opportunities for the next generation. So if people are interested in that, please also get in touch through us in the ways that we can help support national authorities to improve their scientific ecosystems.
No, thank you, Jeremy. And I think that it seems such an obviously simplistic question from Peter, but I thought exactly the same thing. It just exactly summarizes this. I think what we've learned a lot in the research we've done in the last couple of years, and we did quite a significant study with Vasee where we had over 3,000 people come and give this exact evidence to that piece that, you know, we often put it in this framework that trials don't happen in isolation and they can't happen in a vacuum. And whilst trials are really important for evaluating in that very rigorous way, we also need that whole ecosystem of data around trials. And obviously, every disease needs every type of data to answer its questions. And that I think that ecosystem is really important, but it's also a really good entry point for groups to start doing research. And so that brings me to many of the other questions in here in the chat. We really want to do clinical trials. We really want to get engaged in this. One of the questions is around about experience, and they put that they find it difficult to get funding because many of the funders want to show a real history and experience in clinical trials before they fund. How can I get around that? So what the Global Health Network is working very hard to do is to give people experience in that whole ecosystem of studies, and starting, as Vasee put it really beautifully, about measuring what's in front of you and doing very straightforward trials. So I'd like to frame a lot of the next questions that come through about there's so many questions around where do I start with funding or where do we begin with experience? And I think this ecosystem point is really vital. And these guidelines, whilst designed for trials, a lot of the emphasis is on this practical applications about it being adapted. And this is one of the most important points around R3 now, and the changes and the trial resolution is about this flexibility, adaptability. And I think this is some of the biggest changes that have happened for decades. So Vasee, these are such an important document, as Jeremy said, and everybody congratulates the team on bringing these forward and now getting them implemented. Could you talk about maybe how teams could apply them to really help them get over that initial first step of measuring what's in front of you, finding those questions, and how that can follow through then for that sort of ecosystem approach of the pathway to all types of research, which can include trials?
I think for me that it's hard to get beyond the need for domestic support and understanding that research is in some ways is part of care. And I think there are some countries that don't see domestic funding from a part of their health budget as a burden. They see it conversely as, you know, turbocharging their health system. And I think there's a lot of evidence that it can be cost saving if you're really looking at how to most effectively, you know, use the resources that you have. And the resources are not only, you know, procurement resources, but the time of people in the health system. So if we get to the point where more and more countries see that it is absolutely in both the population health, patient health, and their economic interest, and maybe the economic interest is in the world that we live in, you know, what really drives things. If you look at that graph that I showed, I think it's not a coincidence that East Asia is also the the region which is growing the most economically. And I think a lot of these countries are seeing this as a way not only of doing health research, but of driving their own economic development. It's part of their R&D agenda. And so that might be another argument that we use, that we don't only talk to the Minister of Health, we talk to the Finance Minister and the Trade Minister. And Jeremy's just been talking, to the World Trade Organization. So somehow we need to make the case. And in some countries, I think the case has already been made. So without resources, we're not going to get anywhere. But it's how that we have that narrative that there couldn't be a better use of resources than really understanding and exploring what the problems of your own population are and how best to address them. And then this whole framework can help us with more effective use of limited resources, because we do need to lower the bar to research. We need to ensure that we don't have unreasonable expectations around data collection or inspection for low risk trials. So there's a lot that does need to come together, but I'm hopeful, because I do see progress in a number of jurisdictions already. I mean, a lot. It's amazing how much has happened. I can't believe we're still in the same year where we launched the guidance, because since that time, a number of countries have come to us and are moving forward already under their own steam to do this.
Jeremy, John, any further comments on that point?
Move on.
Good. Okay, so exactly, we've got lots to go through. So Theones, thank you, from Uganda. A really important point here, again, echoed slightly different ways across different nations. One of the big problems we all know is ethics and regulatory approvals, and it always seems to be one size fits all, whether it's a RCT for a brand new investigational product, or it's a very practical trial looking at, say, different ways of training nurses or whatever it could be. We're learning a lot around this adaptive pieces you've just explained very well, Vasee, and how we should be able to incorporate different types of approaches using the trial mechanisms and designs. But how do these guidelines, and then how can WHO help support countries with their ethics and regulatory committees adapt their reviews to the risk and complexity of the studies they've been asked to review?
I think it's really important to start with thanking everybody who works on research ethics committees, the regulators, for everything they're doing, because they are playing an absolutely central role. And I think I would start this because I mean, I come from a research background myself, so I'm very familiar with the sense that things are not moving quickly enough. But I would start by saying we really need to value the work of the research ethics committees, and the need for some national authority to strategically oversee the way that research ethics oversight is conducted in the country. That really is a need, and that's something that we discuss in the guidance. What you cannot do if you're working in an individual institutional committee, so a research ethics committee in one institution, there's no way that when you have a national crisis or something that needs to be done at large scale as a multi-site study, you can't do that on your own if you're working in isolation in the institution. So there needs to be some way for them to be in touch with each other. And I was interested in some of the consultations, how in quite a few high-income countries, there is still quite a lot more that needs to be done to have the ethics authorities be able to be in dialogue with each other. And it's interesting to me that, so in the guidance, we're really just pulling out what has been pointed out to us as best practice by ethics authorities, and around the world. The AVRF is in Africa is an initiative which is ahead from what I can see in terms of convening the ethics committees and the regulatory authorities together, and they have still independence to make their own decisions, which is important. But if there's a protocol with 7 national regulatory authorities and 20 ethics committees, they have a way for them to look at it together, to send one list of questions back. And I think that's a really practical way forward to safeguard standards, but also ensure that we have some efficiency. So I think the key message is, do look, I mean, bureaucracy is a sort of negative word, but So what tends to happen over time is that complexity of systems increases. And unless there is some kind of active effort to look at improving efficiency, you tend to get inefficient systems involving multiple bodies. So I think that's really the new element that at the global level that is being added here, that you can't really, the different parts of the system need to work together rationally.
Excellent.
Maybe just to follow up a little bit on that, Trudie, as well. And it goes back to what Vasee was saying about the bar on this. And what we're not trying to do is to kind of lower the standards of ethics or lower the standards of protocols. But what we want to see is, what do we need to do to maintain the basic principles of ethics, of safety and protection of those participating in that? And I think sometimes we're going well over that limit to try and comply with registration or other things based on this kind of one-size-fits-all model. And I think as we start to unpick, and I think the framework is a very good start to this, what are different trials and what do they require? What are the risks? Then I think ethics committees would have better view onto the level of protection that is needed to make sure they're doing it. In the end, the patient's got to be safe and they've got to be enrolled in something that's going to be worthwhile and make a difference. I mean, let's get away from all the technicalities onto this. And that's very different if you're trying a fairly novel compound, for a very serious disease that could have a fatal outcome in here, to whether you're trying to improve the treatment of a milder disease across a bigger population for a public health impact. And I think coming to grips with these elements and realizing that not every trial is the same and linking this to the way that ethics are looked at. The other element of this, though, is that we must continue to try and help strengthen in-country ethics review processes. And we regard this as one of our roles as well, to be trying to get out there, because there's a lot of variability. There are many excellent ethics review committees. There are others that are struggling a bit more because of resources and experience. And it's often hard to tell which is which from the outside. So looking at ways we can systematize and accredit ethics research, ethics review, and build the capacities necessary to do it is this other element. But as Vasee said and Jeremy said, we need to be taking an ecosystems approach to this, and ethics is an essential part of this. It's at the intersection of so much research that needs to be done, not just clinical trials. I think it's something we really need to concentrate on.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. I want probably all three of you to answer if you can, because they're very different, but they sum up quite well. And then I'm going to try and sum up. We've got 7 minutes left to end on time. And I'm going to read this next question literally. So this is a midwife from Rwanda, Jean-Paul Nayoromiri. So the question is, I want to ask for the provision of midwives on clinical trials. And I asked this question as the midwife in Rwanda. I think the reason I'm asking this question for you is because we know on this call we have representation from every level of healthcare worker. And I think given the opportunity of hearing from you as the WHO, I wonder if you could answer this midwife's question on behalf of all the different levels of healthcare worker we've got taking part and their role in being research practitioners. Thank you.
So one of the things, thank you for the question from the midwife. One of the things we try to do is try to ensure that we've received input from all of the levels of the health system, from anybody working in any capacity in the health system, because each one of them will be best placed to have visibility over the questions that need to be answered, the gaps, the practical questions that they have. So again, this comes back to my point earlier that one of the things that I think is part of the history of clinical trials is that in some places, there's this idea that it's something that happened in some shiny building over there, and you have to build a new lab, and everybody, you need a special badge to get in. And we're really trying to get away from that. So we'd really advocate going forward that as resources are secured and go into this work, that we think about how to support the work of health workers, but train. I mean, it can be a career development aspect of the work of any health worker. They may, if they're not interested, that's up to them. But some of them might be interested in undergoing some training, and where your role is to collect data which is very similar to what data you would be collecting as part of your routine job. You may not need very substantial additional training. Now, this idea that you need to go off and have in some countries, I think you're still required to go on what's called a GCP accreditation course, which can be very expensive, thousands of dollars, I think, in some countries. And you're not allowed to take part in a clinical trial without that. I think we need to get to the point where there's much more tailored, nuanced training that's available depending on the type of role that you're expected to play in the study. If you're leading and you're coordinating, then you're going to need very, very extensive training. And our framework will provide some clarity about what those needs are. If you're participating as a site and potentially collecting quite similar data to what you would collect, but in a research framework where clearly the consent process needs a lot of thought, then that's a different type of training need. So we do need differentiated, nuanced approaches to training that allow people to take part.
That's Trudie. I was honoured. Just the first day I started at WHO, I also was I think the first time I'm saying is the chief nurse started at WHO, who sits on the same floor as us at WHO, and I just pay tribute here to TDR, who have taken over for many years, John, the idea that all healthcare professionals, including those without formal training potentially, and community workers and community health workers without MDs or even nursing degrees or whatever, have a role to play if and when they want within their communities in aspects of health research. And also pick out a previous organization I worked for who opened up what were called their clinical fellowship approach to all healthcare workers. And what I would call to any funders on the line is stop thinking that clinical research is done by somebody who has an MD after their name, and anybody involved in the healthcare workforce can contribute to and lead clinical and public health research.
Thank you, brilliant. John, any quick notes?
I totally agree with him, of course. but no, TDR has long recognised, and particularly as we're often working in kind of more vulnerable and remote communities, that getting right down at all levels of the system, right to the social innovators at a grassroots level, and putting research as a tool in their hand can be incredibly valuable in getting that evidence base for scaling or proving intervention. So I think looking at all levels of this, and I totally agree. I mean, I've got a long experience of working in systems with excellent nurses who've contributed fantastically. So I think it is a great resource for the health system in research to be looking at other workers than the clinical researchers. And thinking into those health post orderlies, the people on the hospital wards, the midwives, for sure.
Excellent. I deliberately put this question right at the end, and so thank you for that. So listen, I think we've had some incredible detailed information, and the idea was to really engage with what the importance are of these guidelines. So I want you all to sum up actually with a question that that Matt poses to us, which is, which elements are you each most worried about being missed or not taken up? And I think before I pass you to that, we've just got a minute left, so very quickly. But I think, you know, what we've heard from all three of you is that research is changing fast. Health research is changing fast, and we need to think of health research as this rapidly advancing field where it's there's the opportunity to really think of this as an ecosystem. And the point of these guidelines, and also the new GCP and the resolution, is that nobody's left behind, and that we can drive equity in where research happens and who benefits from the evidence. And so the advantages that we've got in front of us of making patient-centric design, really community engagement, taking up the opportunities of real-world data analysis, and the advantages the data science, including AI, will bring. could all drive better equity if these are taken up fairly and accurately across the world, but they could even make it worse if we don't do this. And so, again, from the Global Health Network, just honoured to work with the WHO on this, and we are very appreciative and congratulate these guidelines from coming out. And it's all of our role on the call here today to help make sure these are implemented everywhere. So just to go around the three of you in these last, as we close out the meeting, just your final comments, please, and which elements you find. I'll turn Matt's question around to which do you think are the most important elements to be taken up? And then we'll thank everybody and close.
Thank you. I think for me, it's actually much more important. It's not important what I think is the priority. What's important is that there are those of you out there where any element of what we've discussed here really resonates with you, has what you need to move forward and really become part of this, because you yourselves absolutely can make a difference. There is a lot of momentum, but in order to maintain that momentum, we need you all to take up the elements that are aligned with your interests. And as far as we can, through the Global Clinical Trial Forum, enable that work, then that probably is the most important part of what we as WHO can do.
Thanks. There's a lot of excitement there, but I'm going to kind of pick on a couple of my hobby horses. In fact, one. But I think the thing that's excited here is the aspects of inclusion and equity. And if we just go to inclusion, you know, we should not be living in a world where women in the South are given a drug that's been registered because of trial results of men in the North. We should not be seeing children given half doses of medicines because trials have not included them because there are obstacles and people haven't registered those. So if we can push to make sure we get inclusion in the trials and an expectation of inclusion all the way through the system, I think we'll really have moved forward a very long way, Trudie.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to everybody that's joined, however many tens of thousands there were. Trudie, thank you for hosting us, Vasee and the whole team for what's done. The final word I would say is just go back and remember when you chose what you were going to do with your life and the inspiration that took you to where you are today, wherever you are in the world today. It was to make the world a better place and improve the lives of ourselves and everybody else. And if we put access and equity at the heart of why we're doing this, then I think will make a difference. And I think that's at the heart of the values of this piece of work. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's a brilliant note to finish on. Thank you for the team behind the scenes who have been running this for us. Thank you everybody for joining. As I say, this is going to be recorded. It will be up there for everybody to watch later in translations. And we really urge you to just to keep commenting. And thank you, WHO, for giving us all this information today. And thank you everybody again for joining around the world, and wish you a happy rest of the day.
Thank you, Trudie. Thank you, everyone.